Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lauri Hetemäki. I'm the Assistant Director of European Forest Institute. It is my pleasure to warmly welcome you to this ThinkForest seminar on Natura 2000 and forests. That is, we are today discussing on the safeguarding of the EU forests, biodiversity in the forest. My understanding is that probably there is a unanimous understanding that this is really important. However, the question, how do you do it? Maybe there's more diversity, or maybe you could even call biodiversity, since human beings are also part of the biome. How biodiverse the views implementing Natura 2000 are, and what can we do to reconcile the different views and improve the Natura 2000 implementation is the topic that we will be discussing here today. In supporting this discussion and helping to answer some questions, we can luckily build on the experience that we have from the 25-year experience of implementing Natura 2000. Given this, I'm very delighted to announce also that today here European Forest Institute will launch a new study on Natura 2000 and forest, assessing the state of implementation and effectiveness. This is based on a science group coming from different countries. You have the summary of the study distributed outside the room, and the whole study is actually freely downloadable from the EFI main website. So on the main website you have a link to that study. The EFI study was commissioned by 10 of EFI member countries' governments to help to provide science-based synthesis, information and recommendations for decision makers. I wish to thank the countries for their support. The countries are listed in the publication. Also, I will not repeat all the countries here. You will hear more about the study by the study coordinator, Metodi Sotirov, today. I would like to already thank Metodi and the study team for compiling this study. Thank you. As you know, the natural world is at the same time complex and simple. It's complex because of the large diversity. But luckily, it's simple in terms that there is one law that governs the nature, evolution. I hope we can say the same thing about Natura 2000. We have huge regional diversity in habitat, the environmental and societal context of the EU member countries in terms of Natura 2000. Yet the 25 years evolutionary process is hopefully pointing also the best practices and the way for strong implementation of Natura 2000. Dear guests, on behalf of the European Forest Institute, I would like to express my thanks for all of you attending this seminar here, and also those through live streaming following us today. Next, I would like to welcome our host from European Parliament, MEP Mark Damesmaeker, to give his opening speech. However, before I let him take the floor, I will just want to express how happy we are having Mark today, because he is probably one of the MEPs in the Parliament that is most informative on Natura 2000. He gave for the Parliament the report on the refit process last year. Dear Mark, it's my pleasure to welcome you on the floor. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind words, and good morning to all of you, dear guests. Also on my behalf, welcome, and I would like to thank the European Forest Institute for giving me the opportunity to participate today. Nature and biodiversity are indeed very close to my heart, I must say. I've been working on these topics for a very long time now in different chapters of my life, let's say, first as a television maker and presenter, then as a member of the Flemish Parliament, also as an alderman in my home city, Halle, and as a city councillor there now, and of course now as a member of the European Parliament, where indeed I was responsible as a rapporteur for the recent biodiversity report. I represent Flanders. I'm playing a home match here, so that's the nation I represent. And of course it is much less wooded to compare to other EU member states, but we have some beautiful forests around here. In my own city, Halle, and of course everybody is in the first place proud of his own hometown and city, we have the Hallerbos, as we say it in Dutch, and it's very famous for its bluebells in spring. You should really visit if you haven't done so before. It is important, the Hallerbos, for 11 protected habitat types and for 10 protected species. And thanks to Natura 2000, efforts are made to improve the quality of the forest, and of course of forests in general, to expand the forests and to combat fragmentation. Forests cover 42% of the EU land area and have multifunctional roles which we need to cherish. They are a source of rest and recreation. They are a habitat for fauna and flora. Their sustainable management has an economic dimension. They contribute to a better climate and better air quality, being the second largest carbon sink after the oceans. Forests are also vital for Natura 2000 and the wider biodiversity strategy. The reason is quite straightforward. Natura 2000 covers 18% of the EU's land territory. Half of the network consists of forests. Furthermore, forests harbour many of the protected species and habitats. Thus, forests are key in realising the overall 2020 target to halt the loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services in the European Union. We all know that in general, biodiversity is still in decline in the European Union. Only 23% of species and 16% of habitats achieve a good status, and we are not at all on track to meet the 2020 goals. However, it is clear that Natura 2000 works. Without Natura 2000, the picture would have been even worse. Scientific evidence like SOAR 2015 and the State of Nature report indeed shows that nature directives are effective when implemented well. The Commission also mentions in the 2016 Natura 2000 and Forests report that forests are generally in a better state of conservation compared to other key habitat groups like grasslands, like wetlands. Moreover, the outcome of the fitness check conducted by the European Commission cannot be misunderstood. The nature directives are fit for purpose and effective. And I'm still very relieved that the Commission finally decided not to touch upon the nature directives, but to focus on the real problem, which is better implementation. My position on a possible reopening of the nature directives was very clear from the start. If it ain't broken, don't fix it. Potential problems are not due to the legislation itself, but above all, the incomplete implementation and enforcement of the directives. Throughout my report, I've also argued that investing in nature and biodiversity should be at the heart of a smart, sustainable and inclusive European Union. Biodiversity is not just about plants and animals, it is about humankind and our society as a whole. It is an essential foundation for our health, well-being and for our economic prosperity. Strong nature and strong economy are not mutually exclusive, quite on the contrary. If the EU fails to meet the 2020 goals, it could cost €50 billion per year. 1 out of 6 jobs in the EU depends, in some way or another, on nature. The costs for managing Natura 2000 are far lower than the benefits it generates. I strongly believe that it remains essential to repeat this message. Many people are not aware of this, with this socio-economic dimension, and still see nature as an impediment to economic development. Therefore, I've also underlined the need for a multi-stakeholders approach. Only a constructive dialogue between all stakeholders, all actors involved, can lead to a changed mindset and to win-win situations. Last April, then, the Commission launched the Action Plan for Nature, People and the Economy to improve the implementation of the nature directives. And although the plan is a step in the right direction, it is, in my eyes, insufficient to achieve the 2020 goals. More efforts are needed, and I will further elaborate on during the panel discussion. I believe that today's conference will contribute to our discussions, and I really look forward to the upcoming discussions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mark. We will not have questions now, and I think during the panel discussion, Mark can take also questions related to this opening, if there are any. The Estonia is currently holding the presidency of the Council, and we are very happy today to have the possibility of having Mark Lamp here, Director Secretary General from the Ministry of Environment from Estonia. Please, Marko, please give your message.
So, dear ladies and gentlemen, good morning to you all. As was already told, I come from Estonia. It's a huge pleasure that EFI have organized this event and has invited us to give words of welcome as well. It's really, for me personally as well, great pleasure to be a part of these discussions, as I have a background in forestry and now more and more responsible in nature conservation issues as well, actually. And really exciting to see what's the discussions going to be like today. As probably the discussion, if you talk to people in forestry field or nature conservation field, there is always some excitement if you talk about conserving the forests. And the views may not be in line all the time. But I think that one thing that remains certain in those discussions is that forestry and protecting the nature both remain essential part of the EU and its people that live in here. About Natura 2000, the network, it involves, of course, also the forests. It's, you can easily say it's world's greatest nature conservation tool that really gives us the practical, it's really a practical instrument to protect our biodiversity. The 1/4 of the Europe's forests being a part of this network really on one hand shows the commitment that we have put into it, but also is a huge responsibility. Since its establishment 25 years ago, we have been constantly improving the network by adding new areas to it, constantly monitoring its status and trying to fit the almost the same regulation to all the member states. We have been succeeding in ones and being not sufficient enough in others. So, what has been gained so far? If you look from the member states' perspective, of course, we have gained a lot of new knowledge about the forests or the values of our ecosystem and ecological processes. Also, we've gained additional protection mechanisms, and we do have more funding to protect our biodiversity in the member states. If you go to the EU level, of course, aforementioned is the same for the whole EU level as well, but we do have also a better understanding how ecosystems work across the country borders as well. We have been finding the best practices across the EU for similar issues. We do have regional groups, for example, at work for large carnivores, for example, and other species that depend heavily on the forest. On a global level, of course, we can proudly say Natura 2000 is most comprehensive network of protected areas in the world. And we can share this knowledge and experience globally and show the leadership in taking concrete action. Still, of course, the system is not complete. Still things to be achieved. I mean, if you take the overall objective of the directives to achieve the favorable conservation status of all flora and fauna threatened in the EU level. And even, we must recognize that even the best tools or the toolboxes have the tools missing, and some job needs to be done still. The biodiversity loss is not halted, as was mentioned before. The network itself, it's still not completed. And all the stakeholders are not involved, of course. You can always say that. And we still do not have 100% long-term commitment to it. As to forests, I think that we still need to seek further the right balance between the nature conservation and forestry, which is going to be vital in the long term. To achieve this, the cooperation between foresters, landowners, science communities need to be strengthened, and also raising the awareness of sustainable forest management practices is crucial. I think it's also important not to forget the landowners and where they cannot get the income from the forest under protection. And we do need to acknowledge the wisdom from the foresters or who are growing the forest and take into account the knowledge that they have and put it into use in protecting the forest as well. But to conclude, I think we have come a long way in building our protected forest network. We just have the action plan adopted to enforce the nature directives for the next couple of years to come. Still, I think we need to start to look beyond 2020, of course, because it's just around the corner. And we have to have a long-term vision of our EU's forests, all in all. And of course, we have to use the most of our science community to give us the solutions, not only to stay leaders in having the best forest ecosystems or the ecosystems protection network, but being leaders in all the other parts of sustainable forestry as well. So I hope that the study that is going to be presented today and the discussions that we're going to have today will give us all some new ideas how to move on and how to achieve those goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lamp. I think we have time for a few questions, if there are any, for Mr. Lamp here. Anyone in the audience? Yes, please, and please introduce yourself, and please use the microphone on the left so that the people following from live stream can also hear you. It's in the handset of your left side. In the
Hello, thank you very much for this interesting talk. I'm Tina Shivacheva from the University of Cambridge. I would like to know about the future plans for the Natura 2000. What is the future, and also the plans with regards to the neighborhood countries, European neighborhood countries? Will they be included in some way, and if so, how? Thank you.
I think we have from the Commission a person today, Mr. Delgado, explaining the Commission, so I would rather keep that question later. Maybe the answer will be in that presentation. Rather, if you have any question directly to Mr. Lamp, please. If not, please.
Yes, Taina Velthem from the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry in Finland. Well, I would like to know that what have been the biggest challenges in Estonia in developing the Natura 2000 network, especially for forests. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think the first years, as maybe some of you know, we are a quite new member to the EU, and as we started to with this process of becoming a member, of course, one of the criteria was to have the Natura 2000 network in place. So that in itself actually was a huge challenge, as we did have some time pressure. And for us, as a relatively new country back then in 2004, as we didn't still have all the landowners' structure evolved, as we come from the Soviet times and just got the independence in '92. I think that in the first stages, to have the right discussion or the level of discussion with the landowners was lacking at the first stages because it just wasn't possible to find them all. It can be looked at. It was a gain for the network as well, actually, because at that point we were able to get some areas for the private land into the network, and we are actually now getting the feedback from the forest owners themselves. So it's the problems are coming up now. So it's really just most important to have the dialogue now when we have more time and still keep them in the process. And maybe one thing that I didn't mention maybe enough was to have private or enough support for those private owners who do need the guidance how to manage those areas, what is the best practices and spots, and they need the right funding for that as well. So this is I think the major issues that we have been struggling. Thank you.
Any other immediate questions? Okay, thank you, Markku. Next, we are going to connect the discussion to a global setting. We have the honor to have a video recording from Christina Palmer, Executive Secretary in the Secretariat of Convention of Biological Diversity at the United Nations Environmental Programme. Unfortunately, Mrs. Palmer is not able to be in this continent today, so next we will have about 6-minute video recording from Christina Palmer. Please.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to have this opportunity to address the Third Forest Forum and outline the connections between global and European forest biodiversity. Let me begin by looking at the status of implementation in the European Union. With nearly 25% of the total forest area in the European Union 28, under the EU-wide network of protected areas, the EU has surpassed the 17% terrestrial quantitative element of Aichi Biodiversity Target 11. Nationally, 23 of the 28 EU countries have exceeded the target due to the significant contribution made, in fact, by Natura 2000 in forests. Thanks to Natura 2000, the EU has the only continental protected area network designed to ensure the restoration or maintenance of natural habitats and species of community interest. Transboundary connectivity is high in the EU, especially along the Alpine Arc and between the Balkan countries. While further work is required on the representativity, connectivity, and effectiveness of the network, the Natura 2000 and Forests report launched today is an important step forward in that direction. Let me point to two developments at the global level that underline the positive effects of Natura 2000 in forests. First, steps to improve data quality, harmonization, and standardization between forest biodiversity reporting systems is a priority issue at both the European and the global level. The international community has articulated 6 global forest goals under the United Nations Forum on Forests. These goals have been devised within the broader development context and are related to topics under the Rio Conventions. As there is commitment by all parts of the international community to provide the information necessary for monitoring progress towards these goals, the approach to follow is meant to contribute to other multilateral targets, like the Aichi biodiversity targets, in a comprehensive, efficient, timely, and meaningful manner. For example, the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity is working with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, and other partner organizations of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests, including a number of national correspondents to the Global Forest Research Assessments. They look at the definition of primary forests and design of a methodology to enhance the quality and coherence of reporting. This could potentially provide a globally consistent source of data for assessing progress under Aichi Biodiversity Target 5 with regards to forests. Together with a number of agencies with responsibilities on forest-related issues, the Secretariat has also been working on a voluntary basis to develop a global core set of forest-related indicators. The overall aim is to simplify and harmonize global concepts and terminology. Activities are also focused on simplifying and streamlining monitoring while respecting the needs of potential users. If well designed, the global core set could provide a clearer and more comprehensive picture of global forest trends. This in turn could lead to a significant reduction in the reporting burden. Ladies and gentlemen, part of the solution lies in reconciling biodiversity conservation and sustainable use with different land uses, forestry and agriculture in particular. As witnessed in Europe, the effectiveness of Natura 2000 has often been challenged by conflicts with landowners or economic sectors. These important actors believe that their priorities are not compatible with the objectives of biodiversity conservation. With similar situations observed around the world, we will need to change this belief through integrated and participatory approaches that attest the costs and benefits of biodiversity conservation for landscape management. This corresponds to my second point. The decision on the mainstreaming of biodiversity into other sectors, adopted at the 13th meeting of the Conference of the Parties in Cancun last year in December, encourages governments to promote the adoption of sustainable forest management practices in the forest sector and forest enterprises and forest owners to integrate the sustainable use, conservation, and restoration of biodiversity into the development and use of forest management plans, voluntary sustainability standards, and/or of voluntary certification systems. This decision is a reaction to the reality that it's not just governments, but a myriad of actors that have an impact, be it positive or negative, on biodiversity through their use of ecosystems and their services. Parties are further encouraged to develop or enhance mechanisms of monitoring and evaluation of the impacts of policies, programs, plans, projects, and strategies relating to forest activities. This is precisely what Natura 2000 and Forests is doing. So I therefore applaud the European Forest Institute for launching this report and encourage you to further identify and develop integrated solutions for forest biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a constructive dialogue.
For us from the global setting also. Next, we have the great opportunity to have Humberto Delgado Rosa from the European Commission, Director of Natural Capital, to give an outlook of EU biodiversity policies related to forests. Por favor, Señor Delgado Rosa.
Good morning, thank you very much. And actually, I would like to thank the EFI and the ThinkForest initiative for this invitation to allow us to be here, but most especially also, I do think this discussion on Natura 2000 forests is extremely opportune. And the study that you have launched and the upcoming study that you've announced are both warmly welcome, because they fit very much in the context we are right now in terms of Natura 2000. I think we had already quite a good presentation of the state of play by Mr. Desmemaker, but the issue is there was this fitness check of the nature directives. It triggered the widest public participation in EU's history. It took quite some time of solid data gathering and solid political decision making. And the conclusion was the directives remain fit for purpose, that we know, but there's a serious need for better implementation. And that's what has triggered what we call the EU Action Plan for Nature, People and Economy, that exactly aims right now to boost that implementation, to increase the coherence with socioeconomic objectives, and to foster engagement with authorities, stakeholders, citizens, with landowners particularly. So when you bring in a report on implementation of Natura 2000, that could be more welcome. And indeed, I identify what I would call a bit of a paradox when we discuss Natura 2000 and forests in Europe, which comes from the following. First, Natura 2000, as was rightly said before, is the largest structured network of protected sites in the whole world. I actually think it's something that we as Europeans should be proud of. Yes, it's difficult to get. Yes, it takes time to establish, but it's quite an undertaking, quite an achievement. It has the specific aim to combine conservation with the sustainable use of the land, of the forests, of the ocean. So it's not at all an excluding human activity objective. On the contrary, and we also have heard it, it now covers in the continent around 18% of the land surface, of which more than some 50% are forests, which implies that grossly 25% of EU forests are within Natura 2000. So, and yet, on this situation, what do we face often? Divergent views on nature versus forests, divergent narratives on forests versus Natura 2000, divergent information on forest biodiversity, and sometimes even antagonist views on how forests and nature should be managed together or not. And of course, how can we aim at getting favorable conservation status, good conservation results, if this underlies the debate on nature and forests? Or how can those that aim at having good forest management succeed if there is this tension with the concept itself in Natura 2000? This is not bad everywhere, but there has been this underlying divergence that we should aim at solve, to filling the gap of understanding and to find the common ground. And I do think your report and this debate can actually help. And first and foremost, I think the FI study brings a big contribution on forest biodiversity monitoring to begin with. Because since I'm in functions in DG Environment for a couple of years, more than once I've heard, how come the EU State of Nature report says what it says on forests? There are those other data that point elsewhere. I don't think, at least on facts, we should try to get the same view. And the issue is, we have around 81 forest habitat types of community interest, around 170 non-bird species of community interest, plus the birds that also benefit from forests. And what we do know from solid assessment that is done with transparency that arrives from member state data, with huge data, huge expertise, is that the vast majority of assessments of forest habitats types of community interest remain unfavorable, as much as 80%. So this is the picture we get, and we often heard, well, the Forest Europe process doesn't say the same. Well, we don't think the divergence is that big, because also in Forest Europe reports you can find that forest-specific biodiversity targets are not achieved. But now your study has shown some clarity on this divergence, which is there are different concepts, definitions, indicators, criteria, methods, governance underlying these different approaches. And it brings a remedy, a solution, a recommendation. Let's pick in each process, Natura 2000 by one side, Forest Europe by the other, the indicators. Let's align the methods. And at least if we can fill this gap on knowledge, we'll have already made a big progress. But now, indeed, and to give you a bit of the vision we have in the Commission of Natura 2000 versus forests, Natura 2000 forests would actually be pretty much a potential model for sustainable forest management if we would achieve exactly what the nature directives aim at, which is to ensure sustainable development compatible with nature conservation. That's where we should get it. And we hope to get and improve towards that. But for this, there's a bit of a divide, another divide we should try to blur. I mean, the tensions around Natura 2000. By one side, they came for sure for interference with property rights. This top-down approach bringing restriction to how I manage my land or my forest, it's very understandably a bad way to communicate. It should come much more as a recognition, you've done well, let's keep doing it because you have nature in your land or your forest. That's a part of it. But there's another part of it that I try to simplify in such a way. We have different worldviews among us humans. And to put it as extremes, a certain worldview says nature knows best. So the less human intervention somewhere, the better value will be there. And the contrasting view would be, well, nature is chaotic. So if we don't have humans making it right, it has no value. I don't think that everyone is either here or there, but there are many, we all split a bit more towards one side or the other of the spectrum. And this is, we should blur this division because nature can retain all its value under human intervention, and a non-intervention nature can have enormous value also. And this also applies to forests. So I think this could also help us, and I've noticed your report identify also the need to tackle ideological divides. So I think this is one ideological divide that we should keep in our mind to approach views. Somehow, in my view of forestry or forests, you can have closer to nature a bit everywhere. Of course, a pure industrial, monotonous and uniform plantation for industrial purposes won't have a lot of nature, while a totally old-growth, untouched, almost pristine forest will have a lot of it. But it's not that either or. We can, in the middle, you can have several degrees of kinds of forestry that can benefit from a bit more of nature. This is the underlying vision I would favor. But now what I would like to bring you here, more than an overall outlook of biodiversity, is on the Nature Action Plan. And first I would agree with Mr. Desmemaker. It's not a magical wand to attain the EU biodiversity targets per se, because there are many unsustainable patterns in many sectors of our societies and economies that have an impact on biodiversity. So it's only the trend towards real sustainability can tackle the wider biodiversity challenge. In essence, I even think that biodiversity loss is a very solid indicator of unsustainability. But it does give a big contribution because up to 2020, we now have a solid action plan that involves all decommission. It's not an action plan for DG Environment, which can bring a lot more solid implementation, smarter implementation on the ground. I won't pass it all in review, we'll know it, but I would like to highlight some main elements of the Nature Action Plan and then the links with forests, what are the closer links with forests. The first point, I think, which will achieve one recommendation of your study, of EFI study, on the better policy coordination. Well, we aim to update and improve guidance towards this smarter, better implementation for better coherence with socio-economic objectives. We will do this. We will also address unnecessary conflicts and clarify the flexibility that the directives as they are, we will not change them, but they do provide a lot of flexibility that is often improperly attained. Another example is we will provide guidance on how to integrate ecosystem services in decision-making at all levels. This for sure can help towards tapping the value of the wider ecosystem services we can get from forests. We'll also, well, of course, the Nature Action Plan will not preclude the discussions on the future financial perspectives, nor on the future common agriculture policy or whatever. That's not the place where you can find that. But you can find the aim to strengthen investment under the current EU funding instruments towards Natura 2000. Synergies with the Common Agriculture Policy, such as Nature 2000 payments, agri-environmental and climate measures, results-based schemes, the farming advisory services, further research and innovation transfer. All this can be better tapped in the current EU funds and the rural development funds. Another point which for me is key, and it's pretty much also addressed in your report, is the engagement with authorities, national, regional, local, and fundamentally the engagement with stakeholders. And there's a special kind of stakeholder among them, which has those that live from the land, the landowners, those that use the land for a living. And for that, we aim to achieve roadmaps for better implementation in dialogue with all these stakeholders. We, of course, will need to rely on the member states to attain this. Now, what could I highlight further that may have a relevance for forests? Well, in the first action on guidance on the implementation of Natura 2000, we have already done actually through a very intense and fruitful dialogue with stakeholders. There's guidance, a guidance document on Natura 2000 forests. We aim at continuing this dialogue to further improve what guidance we can bring in on the best way forward on Natura 2000 forests. There's also an action on knowledge. So I think the recommendations on monitoring that can be found in our study can be plugged into these efforts to bring wider knowledge also on forest and forest biodiversity. There's one action on completing the network. Well, I would say the designation of land sites is pretty much complete. There's still some to get. It's more on the marine side as designation is needed, but there are some 50% of the sites that don't have conservation measures established. What we aim at is to get to 100% sites with conservation measures established. So imagine the great opportunity for a non-top-down imposition of conservation measures, but for a discussion which allows engagement with stakeholders, authorities, all the sectors, including the forest sector, so as to build the legitimacy, but also the ownership, the acceptance of what will be the conservation management measures or the management plans, and indeed, hopefully, the pride of managing the forests in such a way that species and habitats recover their favorable conservation status. I think this better cooperation under this action is one of the most promising ones in my view. Let me also say that's action 6, there will be cooperation increased cooperation. It's an ongoing process at the biogeographical level. We will continue it to support this cross-border cooperation in identifying the best practices at biogeographical level, and this also applies, of course, to forest habitats. The thematic workshops on forest-related conservation management issues is something that will be included in this process. We'll also find an action on addressing conflicts and conflict species such as large carnivores, but that can also be enlarged to other kinds of conflicts related to nature through stakeholder platforms that we favor. There's another action that can be a special interest for the forest sector, which is we will provide guidance on EU-level green infrastructure that can help for the coherence and integrity of Natura 2000. So this means that there can be, if this guidance is uptaken, noticeably in the context of funding or future funding, there can be opportunities for the forest sector to bring in the ecosystem services that more infrastructure, often forests, will bring in. Now, trying to end up, I think, again, the FI study is a big contribution for cooperation across sectors, involving all stakeholders, and these different views that I've referred to towards the commonalities they have is fundamental. Some keywords I would bring to you that I think are important for that. The first one, that this applies to any sector, is first listen. Listen to the others' views. Understand where they come from, what concerns the others, and that's fundamental. First, to have to build an understanding of what will come next. Second, of course, inform on our own objectives, views, concerns, vis-à-vis the common approach. Then involve all the interested parties in design, in the design of plans and projects. Don't come with the solution done. A management plan should be something done together for a Natura 2000 site, for instance. And then be prepared to share responsibilities, this co-responsibility that's also referred in the FI study, as I've seen, and develop these ways to reward the contributions of different stakeholders, especially and also the voluntary contributions. This does not mean only rewarding in money, which is sensible to do in several cases, but there's also reward that comes from recognition of the work well done, which I think is pretty much important. So, in essence, the Commission, or at least we, DGN, largely support the conclusions and several of the recommendations of this study, notably those referring to more cooperation on data collection, on this stronger integration of biodiversity parameters in the assessments and reports, on this cross-sector prioritization, on co-funding opportunities, on sharing best practice, and especially the clue you give us, tackling this ideological divide that is senseless. We have much more to benefit together. Those that aim at sustainable forest management, those that aim specifically to conservation of nature, there's so much that makes us be together, so much more that approaches us than divides us, that it makes no sense to keep any remaining barricades. And I think your report and this event hopefully can help for that. Thank you very much.
Take a few questions.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Delgado Rosa. Muito obrigado. I think we can take a few immediate questions now. Of course, after the next presentation, we have more time for questions and answers. But if there is some immediate questions for Mr. Rosa, please. Yes, Jürgen, please. Please introduce yourself and please use the microphone. It's on the left-hand side of the chair.
I've pushed the button and it's pushed again. I thought you need green and not red to talk, but this is different. Jürgen Bauhus from Freiburg University. You mentioned that you are producing some guidance documents or process for the further development of Natura 2000 in a participatory process with stakeholders. Could you just give us some practical examples? What that means and what sort of guidance you are producing?
Yes, well, I think the best example we have is actually on forests, because on forests there was a group of stakeholders that involved all the spectrum from environmental NGOs to forest producers, forest and landowners, and that have managed to agree on elements. That is now the document that provides guidance on what Natura 2000 means and how it is implemented on forests. We aim to keep this group ongoing for further developments. That's one good example. So there are cases where we have guidance that pre-exists and that can be updated. Some of which, for instance, on hydropower in Natura 2000 or renewable energy or wind power, etc. In those, there will always be a consultation process involved. Other guidance can still be done from scratch, but all of them, what it aims is at ensuring this smarter implementation, fully compatible with the rules, with the text of the law of directives, but that can be better used. There was another question on Natura 2000 in neighboring countries. I don't know if that's still opportune. But I'm pleased to refer, of course, when there are accession countries, we aim to have Natura 2000 there. Now, we don't preach the best approach to neighboring countries, but we favor very much cooperation on nature conservation and also learning with them on their approaches. So the biogeographical process and the dialogues we have with neighboring countries can, of course, also cover nature conservation and what Natura 2000 can offer. Thank you.
Mr. Delgado Rosa made already many references to the EFI studies. And now we have the opportunity to hear from the coordinator of the study, Metodi Sotirov, the presentation on the new study. Please, Metodi.
Good morning, everybody. Dear Larry, dear members of the European Parliament, dear representatives of the European Commission, also of member states' authorities, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Well, basically, I thought that I'm going to present some slides to you. Hopefully, this will be the case in technical terms. If not, then I will try to take the opportunity to hold the presentation in old-fashioned way, in just talking to you. Well, it is, first of all, of course, a great pleasure and honor for me to have this opportunity to present the EFI study. As Lauri already mentioned, it was commissioned by the European Forest Institute, funded by a series of member states in terms of providing evidence to support policy making. The study is based on collaborative efforts involving 20 leading researchers from 10 European countries, representing quite many disciplines, ranging from policy sciences, economics, forest ecology and management, conservation biology, forest management planning, and many others. I'm really glad that I have today a support from Gerhard Weiss and Alistair Jump, two of my colleagues that supported me in the core team of researchers. Well, basically, I'm supposed to give you an overview of the main findings and main conclusions that we drew out of the evidences that we reviewed. And before I'm going to introduce you to the main findings, I would like to highlight that the study was based on solid evidence. In principle, we searched for and reviewed hundreds of scientific articles to be found out there in the academic literature, dozens of available public documents, a lot of ecological data, thank you, and a lot of economic data that was found relevant for addressing the 5 important objects of the study. And these objects referred to first answering knowledge gaps in terms of what is the status of forest biodiversity in Europe's forests, how it is monitored. And I'm really glad that Mr. Rosa already summarized the main conclusions, the main findings, and the main recommendations in terms of this topic. So I'm not going to talk about this any further because of time and space limitations. The second main objective was to take stock and summarize the evidence as regards what is known about the state of, if you like, practical but also legal implementation of the EU nature directives across EU 28. The third important topic that we dealt with focused on how effective Natura 2000 is. Okay, it's very much about ecological effectiveness. The fourth important topic that we dealt with in the study was focused on what is known and what is not known as regards the economic effectiveness of Natura 2000 and how this policy, after all, is funded. And based on these 4 topics, based on the evidence that we reviewed, we drew several conclusions. Let me first begin with outlining the goods, to outline the main conclusions as regards the policy implementation. I think this topic was already addressed this morning, and it is more or less clear that the scientific evidence is showing and supporting all the challenges that have been associated with the formal and practical implementation of Natura 2000. The bulk of scientific studies are really describing those many challenges, those conflicts and those divides and those failures as regards the legal transposition of the EU nature directives into national law. Also, the very many delays and the problems around insufficient designation of Natura 2000 sites, including also in forest ecosystems. And in the literature, there are many explanations to be found that can help us understand why this all happened. And on the one hand side, the one major conclusion is, well, Natura 2000 policy is really very ambitious. And we heard already today that it is kind of our European approach towards implementing the global biodiversity policy, the CBD, based on integrative approach that is supposed to reconcile and integrate both the conservation and the sustainable use of natural resources, in our case, forests. And basically this approach was quite new 25 years ago when the Birds Directive and Natura 2000 were formulated. And most, if not all, member states had really faced challenges in first understanding this new approach and first to make it fit into the traditional biodiversity and forest management, if you like, practices that were traditionally seen based rather on segregative approach, okay? Setting aside certain areas for strict nature conservation and continuing with more or less intensive forestry and other land use operations on the other remaining areas. Well, the other explanation is that there have been quite many differences among the member states in terms not only of the ecological conditions, in terms of the habitat and species that can be found there, but one of the most important and relevant explanation for all the delays and challenges and failures, at least in the initial stage with the implementation of the nature directives, was seen also in the diverging policy priorities, also in some lack of administrative and governance capacities in the member states, but also in terms of, political systems. So all of this could explain the initial challenges and difficulties in implementing the Natura 2000 directives. Of course, all of this triggered counteractions on the side of the European Commission, the European Court of Justice, environmental authorities, NGOs, etc., and they somehow corrected these initial challenges, even helped to remedy them. Then what happened, as we reviewed and seen in our study, that a second stage of implementation started to emerge, namely a second stage of more participatory, open process towards involving the land users, the forest owners, and their industries into, working towards common solutions, working towards development of management plans, guidance documents, etc., etc. And this could be seen as a second and actually the still current phase of Natura 2000 implementation, and this stage is often seen in the scientific literature out there as example for best practices. I'm sorry I'm not able to show you a pie chart, but basically it can be seen and found in our report. But basically we reviewed 66 cases of good practices of Natura 2000. And this is the second part of the story, that not all implementation was faced with failures and problems, etc. But rather we are seeing moves and efforts towards, good practice examples. And the majority of these efforts are still dealing with developing guidances towards how to prepare management plans, etc., etc. From a critical perspective, you can still say that, well, even after 25 years after the adoption of the Habitats Directive and 15 years after official experience with official implementation, we are still talking about guidances, we are still talking about concepts, how to put objectives into practice. From a positivist or a positive view, one can see, well, it took the time it has to be taken. So it's a learning process, it's a big endeavor, it's a big project. So it's quite normal that it took the longer time that it needed. All right, I'm moving now towards the second topic, namely, okay, what is the effectiveness of Natura 2000 out there in the fields? And well, the evidence is quite mixed. On the one hand side, yes, judged in accordance with the official data about conservation status, and we heard that already by the previous speakers. So the majority of forest habitats and forest-dependent species are still in unfavorable conservation status, 80% of them, etc. We heard that already. So one could conclude, well, the Natura 2000 policy is not really effective. But, well, this is not true, as the previous speakers pointed out. Then also in the scientific literature, there is a strong evidence that whenever both nature directives are implemented in appropriate way, then there are really positive effects that are following out of this appropriate implementation, meaning that if you apply both pieces of legislation in the way that they were intended, then you will more or less end up in positive effects of the Natura 2000. On the other hand side, in our study, we discovered also few other important points that need to be considered in future work, namely that basically next to the establishment and management of the Natura 2000 sites, other important factors having already an impact also on the conservation status of habitats and species. And these are these global megatrends like climate change, for example. Okay? Meaning that all those concerned with Natura 2000 management, they have to bear in mind that the network has to be managed in a way that it's able to cope with climate change-induced developments like species migration, changes in habitats, etc. Also, managers and policymakers, decision makers, they have to also look into the impacts not only of climate change, but also nitrogen emissions, but also land use and forestry operations. Very often, the argument is made in the literature that because of these impacts, the Natura 2000 approach needs to be made more dynamic, more flexible. And there are quite many different understandings of what of this all should mean. For some, there is a big need to further work towards the so-called green infrastructure. I think Mr. Rosa already pointed to this need, to enlarge the network or to better connect its elements. For others, mainly the land users, they understand under flexibility rather to get rid of top-down implementation instruments and processes to allow forest owners, land users make their decisions. And here, this is both, the latter point is both a strength but also weakness, because yes, we have to involve forest and landowners. This is one of the major arguments in the scientific literature out there, and we fully support these arguments. But on the other hand side, they are, at least in the past, we found quite many examples and solid evidence that forests or other landowners either did not take seriously the implementation of Natura 2000, even so also public authorities, because, for example, there are many instances where management plans are either not existent at all in many member states. Some of them are not legally binding for example, private forest owners in some countries. And in the countries where management plans do exist, still the ecological thresholds defined, the ecological and conservation objectives defined are far below the scientifically proven ecological needs of habitats and species. So there is one argument that, there is a fear that if Natura 2000 legislation is not taken really seriously, then there is a fear that it will not deliver on the expectations put on it. Okay, I'm moving further on with the topic of the economic effectiveness and the issue of how Natura 2000 is funded. In our study, we made several important observations. First of all, and this was, I think, already mentioned, yes, Natura 2000 implementation can trigger substantial costs for forest owners, for authorities, for other stakeholder groups like forest-based industries, etc., etc. But on the other hand side, the total value of Natura 2000 in terms of the plenty and variety of ecosystem goods and services that are provided in these areas by far exceeds the cost. And there is one important problem with that it is on the one side the forest owners that have to bear the cost, and on the other side we have the large public that benefits, most of them. And this situation, this challenge is further then exaggerated and becomes even more tangible, even more important to consider, given the fact that, as outlined in our and reviewed in our study, there is apparently a lack of funding for Natura 2000, meaning that forest owners either cannot be compensated the way they need, or, and this is another part of the story, there are some forest owners that don't want to be compensated. They don't want to be part of the Natura 2000 implementation because of the ideological reasons and blockages that Mr. Rose already referred to. But it's not only a problem that involves forest owners. It is rather also still work to be done on the side of public authorities that manage those funds. I really regret that I'm not able to show some interesting figures, but in essence, the majority of funding for Natura 2000 comes actually from the rural development program and the rural development policy. And in the previous funding period, 2007-2013, the experience was that only 12 member states out of 27 or 28 now used rural development funds to fund Natura 2000. And even among these 12, actually not all of their regions really use rural development funds to support Natura 2000 implementation. And as regards the new current programming period under rural development policy, the situation is quite similar. The only difference is that probably a bit more countries opted to use rural development plans. Now we have kind of, I think, 18 member states that chose and opted to use rural development funds for Natura 2000 payments. Remember, 18 out of 28. But still, among these 18, only 12 are really, or even only 10 are really ready to use these funds, because there are still quite many conflicts among the institutions involved. Remember, on the one hand side, you have the Natura 2000 policy, and it's rather the environmental authorities on the domestic and sub-national level that are in charge of its enforcement. But the money that should actually support this enforcement lies in the responsibility of mainly authorities that are responsible for agriculture or forestry issues. And very often these two institutions don't work together, or they don't jointly make decisions about how to fund Natura 2000 policy. All right, I have 1 minute to conclude my very interactive talk. And I will do my best to convene the main messages. First of all, and I really very much liked the appreciation by Mr. Rosa. Yes, in our study we identified 3 major challenges that need to be addressed in order to for us to be able to move forward with Natura 2000 first, and this is what Mr. Rosa already addressed. Decision makers, practitioners, we all scientists need to join forces in order to address these ideological or knowledge-based, thank you, knowledge-based challenges. So I'm going to go directly to the very first slide here. Okay. And we think that, and we recommend in our report that these ideological information challenges are best addressed when there is a two-way communication between authorities and stakeholder groups. And this communication needs to lead to a situation where all involved parties clearly and jointly discuss and address win-win situations, but also trade-offs that involved in the implementation. I already talked about the economic challenges, and here, this is the second point I would like to highlight. There is a need to tackle economic and funding challenges, and we suggest and recommend that there should be a joint ownership to be built among the responsible authorities representing the agriculture, forestry, and environmental sectors. And there should be also joint responsibility for funding Natura 2000 across the European levels. I mean, connecting the decision-making here in Brussels with the national capitals and also with the regional capitals across Europe. So that compensation payments are activated and provided to those that need it, to the forest and landowners. And we think that, and this is probably the hardest challenge that needs to be tackled, we think that it's very important to address institutional challenges, because we are still seeing quite many examples of lack of coordination, lack of policy integration between the involved sectors. And there is, of course, much more efforts to be done among the practitioners representing forestry and nature conservation. They need to talk quite more often and to discuss win-win but also win-lose situations in order to learn from each other what is possible and what is not possible to implement. I'm skipping all the next points because I already addressed them, and I do agree we need to share our experiences, our knowledge, and support very intensive dialogue between the nature conservationists on the one hand side and the forestry guys. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Methodi, and I apologize for the technical problems. You did excellent with this. The presentation will be on the EFI website tomorrow, so all those that today lost it will be there. Now we have about 10-15 minutes time for discussion, first directly to Methodi or the other speakers of this morning. So when you are addressed, please come in the front of here so that everyone also in the web live streaming can hear you. Any questions to Methodi, please, about the study? Yes, please. Please introduce and use the microphone.
Thank you. Hello, good morning. My name is Piotr Borkowski. I represent the European State Forest Association, which is one of the stakeholders present in this public debate, including on Natura 2000 in forests. And then with my question, actually, I would like to refer to one of the aspects mentioned both by Mr. Delgado Rosa and by Methodi in their presentations. I mean, particularly, this is this co-responsibility, sharing of responsibility. I would like to ask for if both of the gentlemen could give a bit more precision what kind of responsibility they do mean. Is it political responsibility for implementation? Is this something to share between the decision makers and then landowners or forest managers to be jointly responsible for the end results for the implementation, particularly in the field? I understand, and maybe least clarification I would need when it comes to sharing of the knowledge, especially from research, because it's pretty obvious that the researchers has a lot to offer when it comes to implementation of Natura 2000. So then if I can ask for a bit more clarification and precise argumentation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Thank you so much, Piotr. In our study, we propose two types of joint responsibility. One is many targets towards a joint policy making under the umbrella of policy integration. Policy integration is a scientific term that basically means the following things. Two sectors or more need to come together. They have to start working together in a sense that they have to define common goals and objectives. And they have to make sure that there is a coherence between their objectives and that there is consistency between the implementation instruments that these parties are meant to support and imply in order to support the overall joint objective. And if this is implemented, so the evidence, this means also that the many sectors involved, they in the end need to give up some of their decision-making power. And this is, I know, the hardest thing to do in the politics out there, because we believe that, and there is solid evidence out there that policy sectors are not really eager to give up some of their decision-making power. And we we gave an example in a study how this could work, or we suggested at least what can be done. And by taking the example of the so-called Natura 2000 funding gap. So I hopefully outlined that currently the situation is not really very supportive, because on the one hand side, you have the agricultural and forestry ministries that are in charge of all these rural development payments. But, well, in many countries, these funds are not really programmed, are not chosen, they are not really activated, and there are quite many important political reasons for not doing so or for doing so. So this is kind of a stumbling block towards supporting Natura 2000. And on the other hand side, you have, of course, the environmental authorities that are mainly in charge of the legal and practical implementation of Natura 2000 forests, but they are lacking this instrument of funding, okay? And we are proposing in our study that if Natura 2000 goals are to be achieved, this situation needs to be improved, either by, and this is now, of course, the most important part, either by make sure that these two sectors talk better to each other, that they coordinate their priorities, that they work towards supporting Natura 2000. And we give there 2 or 3 examples how this can be done. For example, it could be that all responsibility about funding can be shifted to the environmental authority. Then it will be the environmental authority being in charge of both the legal enforcement, but also offering the funds as, you know, the carrots and the sticks in the policy science language. Or the other way around, that the main responsibility for implementing Natura 2000 is transferred from the environmental authority to the rural development authority, in the sense that there is a one hand that manage both things, okay? The legal pressure, but also the incentive measure. But, and this is very important, in either cases, we recommend that the other party that will give up some of the responsibility should be involved in any case in joint decision making and and coordination. That's all.
Thank you. Mr. Delgado.
Maybe I can reply from here. Well, I think we've heard a lot already on what co-responsibility means, but let me tackle this way. Yes, I think humans have different tendencies. One tendency, I have my power, I don't share it. But we also are rational entities that understand when cooperating I benefit, even if I share my power. So the possibility is out there. And I think the example of the funding is the best one at political level. This diagnosis that you often find agricultural authorities with the money, but unwilling to really apply it in Natura 2000 because it's not in their remit, while you have environmental authorities with the remit and not the funding. And even when they are in the same ministry, dialogue or coordination does not necessarily come in. So how can we change this? I have one clue to share with you. If we say that the Common Agriculture Policy or rural development delivers for the environment, then the evaluation of such delivery should be totally aligned with the environmental policy. So it would be the targets, the indicators, and the plans from the environment that would measure that part of the agricultural funds that are aimed to attain the environment. That's not what happens nowadays. If you see the Common Agriculture Policy, these indicators aim at sustainable management of natural resources, but are not linked with river basement management plans, Natura 2000 management plans, air quality plans, etc. If we change that, then even if whoever is responsible for agricultural funds does not have the remit of Natura 2000, it will be evaluated in the end on the policy coherence, on the good use for money, on how much it delivered to the management plan. So we need to plug in these elements that force co-decision, that force dialogue, because the natural tendency for this dialogue is not always there. Another level, totally different, is on elaborating a management plan itself. It's if one authority following the environment cooks a management plan and then tries to impose it top-down on the forest owners, on the state forests, on the other ministries, the success rate will be much lower. So the way to do is, we have some ideas for a management plan. What about your ideas? Let's join together and try to find something that will comply with the ultimate goal, attain favorable conservation status. If we are under this mode, we attain co-responsibility, co-ownership, co-pride in the final results. So we must do it at all levels. I actually think state forests are in a very good position on being state and not private to have this articulation in nature conservation authorities so as to get to this co-responsibility clearly adopted and transparent for everyone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Delgado Rosa. I think this has been warming up for the forthcoming panel, and I would like to welcome my colleague Georg Winkel, who is the head of the Resilience Program in EFI in the very new Bonn office that was officially launched last month. Please, Georg, and please introduce your panelists. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning also from my side. Actually, I wanted to start this panel discussion by saying now it's the end of the PowerPoint presentation. It's time for interaction. But I have to admit that this is now not the right introduction anymore. Really congratulations to you, Methodi, for doing a perfect job without a PowerPoint presentation, because from a scientist perspective, that's always the nightmare, that you start your presentation, but you don't know what to talk about, but you knew what to talk about. Now it's time to reflect a bit on the study, but also to have a bit of broader discussion on Natura 2000 and forest. And I would like to introduce, and I do not want to do this by myself and alone, but I would like to do this with some panelists, and I would like to introduce them, and perhaps while they are coming here up front, I can do this. The first panelist is Emma Berglund. She's the Secretary General of the Confederation of European Forest Owners, has a background in forestry, and recently Emma received the Grave Carl Bernadotte Forest Prize from the Swedish King for her ability to explain in Brussels what sustainable forestry is in practice, and I think this is one of the reasons why you're here. Emma, please take a seat. The next panelist is Professor Jürgen Bauhus, Professor of Silviculture at the Faculty of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Freiburg. He has published extensively on forest management issues, on the dynamics and management of structures and composition of forests, carbon and nutrient cycle, and has also recently contributed to a review study on biodiversity issues in forest management. And I think he is mostly here to give us a bit the biophysical science, forest management science perspective on Natura 2000 and forest. Then I'm happy to introduce Andreas Baumüller. He's the head of natural resources at the WWF, European Policy Office, and Andreas has acted as an NGO coordinator and the WWF head of the EU Nature Alert campaign during the REFIT process. And he has previously worked a lot more on the ground, I think, in Austria. Then I'm happy to introduce Christian Bateau. He's now Inspector General of the Environment in the French Ministry of Environment or Ecology. I think it has been renamed, perhaps several times. And he's an interesting person specifically because he has different hats on. He was the Deputy Director in charge of forestry in the past, and then later the Deputy Director in charge of protected areas in the French administration. And he has also in 2015 coordinated a national assessment.
You're supposed to be there because there are not enough seats.
Okay. I would have found out that when the last one was looking for a seat. I'm staying here until the sixth person is joining the panel. He has coordinated also a national assessment on the implementation of the French Natura 2000 network. Then already, he has been introduced already, Mart Demesmaeker. So I'm not introducing you again, but it's great that you are still here. And I heard that you have prepared already for some things to be discussed here in the panel, even though you spoke already. Perhaps happy that you are here. And now I think I have to move, but I still will speak, and then I run over there. I'm happy to introduce also the last participants in the panel, Rudolf Blockmann. Here he is, and now he is the chief forester of the wonderful, beautiful forest district of Bad Tölz. And he was before that in the Bavarian Ministry of Food, Agriculture and Forestry, and also in the Bavarian State Chancellery as an advisor for forestry matters. And he has also worked in the quite famous Steigerwald region, I think, as a forester. So he has almost 20 years of practical experience of how to integrate nature conservation into forestry management. And while you are taking a seat, I'm moving over there. Okay, let's start. And I think one of the things we decided or that we propose to concentrate on is a bit to reflect on one hand on the Natura 2000 and forest study, but on the other hand also a bit on the broader setting, for instance, the action plan for, let's call it, better implementation. And to begin, I asked the panelists to prepare a very short, maximum 2 minutes reflection on what they have heard in the previous session, namely on the study, focusing on 2 key points. First of all, what they consider is the most important finding of the study in the context of the Natura 2000 and forest process. And then secondly, also relating from that, what's their one key policy conclusion they want to emphasize. And I would now like to give the floor. Perhaps we reverse the order and start with the on-the-ground level with Rudolf Blochmann to give a short reflection on what we have heard. What's your key impression on the implementation of Natura 2000 and forests, and what's your one core policy conclusion?
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation to this panel discussion here. Let me first give you an idea about the Bavarian State Forest. We are an enterprise founded 2005, and we are a state forest, state of Bavaria in Germany, managing about 800,000 hectares of forest land. We are one of the largest public forest enterprises in Europe. And we are, of course, member of Oyster4, which just mentioned before, responsible for 1/3 of the European Forests, Association of European Forest State Organizations. Well, our strategy, our forest strategy, is basically focused on a balance of economic success, nature conservation, and benefits for society. And we strongly believe in a system which integrates nature protection into forestry management. And we doing this since decades, what we call it like a close to nature forestry without clear cuts, with special programs for certain species and with certain approaches for bringing, for example, swarms into a better shape. So basically, we are pretty near to, with our philosophy, we are pretty near to Nature 2000, and so we don't have major problems with Nature 2000 so far. Implementation, this is a thing we discuss later, as I understood, is by 50% now in Bavaria, so it's not completed anymore. But what I experienced over the last years in roundtables, in local roundtables, was one major point which was in your study, one of the major points too. It was a question about how to communicate with landowners and with forest owners. I got the impression that a lot of the forest owners think that the reality today is pretty different from the idea which was originally told to them years ago about Natura 2000. And they fear that the idea of integrating nature conservation into forestry management is probably in danger, and they fear a segregation models. Yeah, they fear that lots of areas will get out of production and they will lose their property. This is the main fear. So my main objective would be, or my main thing I would tell politic would be really take that serious and make clear that it's not a broking about national parks or little national parks. It is a program which wants to integrate nature conservation aspects into forestry management.
Thank you, Rudolf, for highlighting the integration aspect and the need for better communication, specifically with landowners. Mark, what did you learn from the study, and what is your policy conclusion if you have this one big?
Yeah, there are several, but let me say, I was happy to hear and to read when I went through the report that the 2 important findings of the study are largely concurring with what I have said and what, together with the other rapporteurs, the shadow rapporteurs, in my biodiversity report in the European Parliament. And first of it is the clear need to involve all stakeholders. invest in win-win dialogue. I really believe that is essential to book success. And I can give some examples from my own experience. For instance, the Flemish Sigma Plan. This is a future-oriented project for the areas surrounding the river Scheldt. You know, the Scheldt that where Antwerp is situated at the river Scheldt. It will make our region safer, more climate-proof by protecting it against floods. But it also has a very important nature pillar. It will create, I thought, about 4,000 hectares of nature. And complementary, in addition, it has an important economic dimension for commercial shipping. So several stakeholders, sectors have found each other in a win-win situation. Another example, here close by, the Estonian forest, Estonian woud, which was recently recognized by UNESCO, and where we equally see that cooperation between stakeholders can deliver results. It is an interregional cooperation also, and I can assure you, regional borders can be more of a challenge than real state borders, which is the case in Belgium. But it is an example of success. I can give another example of very local levels. I was an alderman in my home city where where I started up a project called, it's a plan, Boommarter in Dutch. I think the English name is Pine Marten, which is of course a symbol and a mascot for a project that would connect the existing forest complexes we have, also involving the different stakeholders, agriculturists, but also the citizens bottom up, and where we managed to have some success. So it is very important. Second, as I've mentioned during my opening speech, we need to stress the socio-economic necessity of investing in nature. Not always clear to people. The costs of implementing the nature directives are smaller than the benefits they generate for society. And we need to raise awareness in this regard to ensure also public funding, appropriate funding is available. Now, regarding the conclusions on forest biodiversity monitoring, I've listened very carefully, I've read very carefully, and I'm really much in favor of evidence-based policy. And I believe that monitoring is necessary. And it's important that monitoring networks are focused on specific objectives. They should be lean, smart, and flexible. The conclusions, however, suggest that various networks lead to contradicting information. I'm open, of course, I'm open for everything and open but I find it hard to share that view. I'm convinced that results of existing monitoring networks can be complementary, are complementary, and number one challenge is to integrate the information sources with their different complementary dimensions into comprehensive conclusions. But of course, I'm ready and I'm open to listen for any other argument here. Maybe I'll leave it.
Yeah, I'm quite impressed by the amount of conclusions you made already. But in order to give the other participants, panelists also the chance to throw their 2-minute statement, I would like to continue with Christian Bartot, who is a bit integrating many things in his own person. What is your main conclusion, or what did you get from the presentation of the study, and what's your one big policy conclusion out of that? Christian.
Okay. Everybody can remember the big conflicts about Natura 2000 in France during the 90s. The main cause was that what is scientifically relevant may not be socially acceptable. Conflicts are not especially about scientific items. They are about the conception of freedom, private land ownership, and so on, cultural aspects. And so the first priority was to establish mutual understanding between foresters, scientists, and NGOs, to establish confidence about the ability to agree about reasonable options, and to establish motivation to act. Donc it's possible to discuss, to agree about management plan, but if you don't agree about the need to implement, it's only documents. And so it is a step-by-step approach, and it is well described in the report. And so it's clear that the first generation of management plan is not perfect, but the most important thing is to create the climate to have a better second generation of management plan. Now in France, 85% of the sites have a management plan which has been approved, and 10% are still in discussion. And 75% of the sites have a facilitator in charge of Natura 2000. The report wrote, it seems that France substantially changed the initial ecological scientific-based approach to a user-friendly collaborative approach. Okay. But only partly okay, because the question takes into consideration only scientific objectives of the directive and not simultaneously the social acceptance and the good willingness to improve the nowadays situation. And Natura 2000 is a long-term policy. We must take time to learn from experience, and we must promote adaptive management. They are the best lessons from the French experience, and it's clearly approved by the report.
Thanks a lot, Christian, for giving already a bit of perspective in France. We will come back to this later if we have the time. Andreas Baumüller, I'm looking forward to hearing what you learned, most importantly, and what your policy conclusion is from the report.
Thank you very much. I would like, before I give the answer to the two questions, a very quick feedback of the team, which in my unit is looking at Natura 2000 in 20 different member states. We are active in 20 different member states. I just would like to give you a flavor so that you get a bit of feeling what my team tells me, what I should bring back to the plenary today. First of all, there's a feeling it's a very inconsistent implementation happening between member states, so very diverse. Even in some member states, implementation is happening in a very, very different way, which is not new to us. If I look at the UTR, the timber regulation, the Water Framework Directive, it's everywhere the same. It's the dilemma that when you do not want to dictate from Brussels what member states should do, and I think it's still the right approach, because you need to have flexibility, and that's also shared by my team. They also thought it's very positive to discuss Natura 2000, and especially the discussion around the federal conservation status with forest owners have helped also to create more deadwood in forests, which I think is reflected also in a better status of birds in forests than in other habitats like in grasslands. So there's a very positive element linked to that, and also to the establishment of the Natura 2000 network. What is seen as very critical, and my colleagues also theme that this is not understood still by many forest owners, is the importance of old-growth forests. I'm not just thinking about the discussion we're having in Poland on Białowieża, which many people of you are aware. There are many different parts in Europe where we have old-growth forests. And I think it's a difficult debate because it's likely linked to the non-intervention management, which is difficult to discuss with forest owners, of course. So that was just to give you a bit of a flavor of the feedback of the team I have asked. The conclusion, I think, and my major conclusion, which I take out of the report, and it's written down sometimes in between the lines, sometimes with any other recommendations, and it's called also in the report political will. And I think the political will as such is not the cause of the failure, it's a symptom. And the symptom that there's not enough political understanding and not enough political support to implement what politicians have decided. So we have, in a way, a public policy failure, and it's a public policy failure on the implementation, because there was political will in '92, and there was political will last year to say yes to the Birds and the Habitats Directive. You could say there was probably political pressure, and there's also a difference between political pressure and political will. So what I take forward is we need to look far more onto establishment of the political will, which means you're not working on the cause of the failure, you're working more on the symptoms. You need to convince politician makers to get more support for Birds and the Habitats Directive, and especially for the implementation on the Birds and the Habitats Directive. And by putting this on your head, you would have a different way of releasing a report. You would not go into specifics, you would not speak about the problems, you would speak about, and you're trying to convince decision makers to get support for the implementation on the Birds and the Habitats Directive. What is the one most important message? Invest in Natura 2000, and I call it investment in Natura 2000, which I think the report sometimes, most of the time, calls it the costs, the burden. And I think we need to take another language. If you want to speak with politician makers, if you want to get on your side, you need to speak about an investment. An investment is positive. An investment brings something back to you. It's not a cost. And I think that's what I would take forward as the main message for the policy making. And when I'm having a meeting with the cabinet of Juncker, Timmermans, Vella, I'm always calling it the investment in Natura 2000 and the return of costs which you have by investing in Natura 2000. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Andreas. The next for highlighting the political will dimension and the investment dimension, also something to come back to. The next on my list is Jürgen Bauhus. What did you learn from the study regarding implementation effectiveness of Natura 2000? And do you also have a policy-related conclusion out of that?
Yeah, thanks, Georg. I think the report confirmed my view that Natura 2000 is really a modern conservation approach. And I think that has to be stressed. It realizes that the conservation of biodiversity does not rely only on the reservation, on the total reservation of forests where we lock up forests, but it depends on the composition, on the structure and the disturbance regime of forests, all which we can manage. And that also puts the land managers, or in this case the forest managers, in a completely different role. They're an active partner. They're in charge of managing this resource to achieve these objectives. And the objectives of Natura 2000 are very much in line with the objectives of most, at least public, forest management authorities. It's perhaps a different issue with some private forests. It also shows that the principles of Natura 2000 are well grounded in ecological knowledge in terms of the selection of habitats and also how we manage them. Much of what's happening on the ground is related to a concept what we now call retention forestry, where we retain dead wood, old big trees, etc., as has already been mentioned. And that has proven to be effective in case studies. However, I was surprised really to read that we have so little evidence for that from the reserve system as such. And I think this is very important. Obviously, we have contradictory monitoring systems that deliver different results. And coming back to the policy, I think this is an absolute no-goer. We all know that the resources are limited. And why do we have different monitoring systems where people measure different things with the aim to come to different views? It is absolutely necessary that Natura 2000 is evidence-based. I'm also a firm believer of evidence-based policy, because only if we do have that evidence can we actually bring people to the same table. So we need to agree on the facts. We don't know enough about, say, the difference in the effectiveness of Natura 2000 versus non-listed forests, and not enough about the network itself across biogeographic regions, across boundaries between member states, etc. The other thing that I thought was very positive from this report were some of the case studies of good practices that were put forward that really show what Natura 2000 can initiate and trigger. And I've got most experience with that also from the state where I live in Baden-Württemberg, I don't think that we would have an all-encompassing concept for the conservation of biodiversity in forests. I don't think that we would have on-the-ground implementation of a program for retention forestry to conserve old trees and dead wood. And we probably wouldn't have had a revision of the management guidelines specific for different forest types in line with these conservation goals if it hadn't been for Natura 2000. So I think it does, it certainly has the potential to trigger much. But my, I think, most important plea for, or policy recommendation would be to move towards an evidence basis for the effectiveness of Natura 2000 and to do that in a most efficient way.
Thank you, Jürgen, for a clear statement for evidence-based policy making. Emma, you were the first to be introduced. Now you're the last to have this introductory round. What did you learn from the study regarding implementation of Natura 2000 and effectiveness, and what's your one key policy conclusion?
Thank you for that, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. So as you've heard, I'm representing the private forest owners, so the 60% of the forests that are owned by private forests as opposed to the state forest we've heard about earlier. I think the study is very interesting. There are many conclusions in there which are interesting, but I will just highlight two now and then come back to a few more maybe later in the discussion. So I think the first point for us, and which is what we have also highlighted throughout the process of the Natura 2000 implementation, is the involvement of stakeholders, and particularly the involvement of the forest owners, which you've heard earlier today here as well. This is fundamental to have the forest owners on board to gain acceptance and to really get them on board and have a more bottom-up approach. And I was a bit astonished to hear earlier that forest owners don't take Natura 2000 seriously. And I can assure you that forest owners take Natura 2000 very, very seriously. And I think we've seen in the past that there has been a lot of conflict and there has been a lack of trust from forest owners because of these kind of problems, challenges, which we also heard from the Estonian presidency. The forest owners didn't even know that their land was being designated, or what did that mean for them. So of course this creates tensions, and then there is also the aspect of the costs being borne by the forest owners, but not the benefits, and all kinds of issues here. So this we need to move away from. And of course the integrative approach is also something very close to also the private forest owners, and as we've heard from the state forest as well, forest owners have been managing their forests with multiple objectives in mind for decades, also before this term was coined and the Natura 2000 came to be. So sustainable forest management and multifunctionality has always been a part of the management we have in Europe, although of course we always develop and improve, but balancing objectives is at the core of the daily business. Another point which was very interesting in the study was the need for flexibility and adapting measures over time, also taking into account the long time frames we have in forestry. And we heard a bit about what this could mean. This could mean different things for different people. But definitely we need to take into account that nature is dynamic, and we need less top-down approaches. And we also need to take into account better understand the impacts of climate change, which is also accelerating these changes in nature, and which is one of the biggest challenges to biodiversity conservation. So my one most important message would be coming back to the involvement of the forest owners in all stages of the process in an adequate way, and connected to this also the acknowledgement in all nature policies of ownership rights, which is something we heard about earlier today. So ownership rights, having strong and secure ownership rights, it's the fundament of having a long-term acceptance, long-term sustainable forest management, and it guarantees that we have this approach from the forest owners, the commitment, and this also gives us the biodiversity that we want. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Emma. And I forgot to say that you should all take notes of this and write down your most urgent questions. We will open this up in about 15 minutes for questions from the plenary and then you have the chance to directly address the panelists with your concerns. Rudolf, I would like to come back to you with your 20 years of experience with integrated forest management. Integrated forest management was highlighted by the previous speaker, by Emma, for the private forest owners. And you mentioned that you have a lot of experience in the Bavarian State Forest with this approach. I would like to dig a bit deeper with you, so to say. How does this work in practice? And then coming to the challenges that the study has identified, also on the, let's say, more on the ideological side, so to say, on one hand, but also on the side of potential economic trade-offs. How do you deal with this in the Bavarian state? Does it work easily for you? And then perhaps finally, you mentioned that there's a need to integrate private forest owners. How do you see this in Bavaria? Is there a difference between what the Bavarian state forest are doing and what private forest owners are doing?
Yeah, so how do we integrate nature conservation in our forest management plans? We're doing an inventory every 10 years, very intensive inventory where we measure all sorts of things, and we measure nature, we measure points which are very important for nature conservation, like amount of dead wood, like number of habitat trees, and things like that. So we measure that too. So we know exactly how much dead wood per hectare we have in our different departments and how many habitat trees we have. Then we make a forest management plan, and additional to the forest management plan, we made for every region, we make a special nature conservation plan, which brings up special programs for species like bats, like birds, like fish. So we think about how to improve little streams and rivers, how to bring back swamps to the original state. This is one big thing in Bavaria right now, to do that. And then we measure, after 5 years, we measure the success of all we wanted to do, or all we described in our management plans. So that's basically the way we do it. And then we have like the key factors in forestry management for nature conservation are dead wood and number of habitat trees. And then we have a program which comes to old forests. So we have a rule at the Bavarian Forest Service that every stand which is older than 180 years, if it's a beech stand, and like where I work in the mountains, where we have mixed stands out of fir, spruce, and beech, what we called mountain forest. If it's older than 200 years, it will get out of production. Category 1 forests in our language, and we have about 10,000 hectares of Category 1 forest. Category 2 forests are close to the nature, or to the forest which would be produced by nature, and it's younger, it's older than 140 years, and those are harvested, but not with clear cuts, very close to nature, and they regenerate with those local trees. And my colleague told me that you visited Bavaria and they showed you part of those things I'm just telling now. So you are my witness, and in this way. And the last thing are stands which are not close to nature, like brew stands on typical beach sites, and those stands we want to transfer into stands which are closer to nature, because we really believe that we have the highest stability, and at the end of the day, the highest income with forests which are close to nature, because they are safer. If you talk about storms and bog beetle and all these threats forests are facing.
But then to ask again, from the policy side, are you then, sorry for interrupting, but are you then sort of happy with the current framework? Or do you see a need for a more supportive policy structure for your enterprise to work in this It seems that you are doing quite fine.
Basically, we are not unhappy. We see some problems with the flexibility. That was the thing you mentioned, especially with if you have too strict rules about recomposition in areas where you have to shift, or where nature or climate change will shift that recomposition anyway. So we see a need to shift it. There are very strict rules about that. What we would like to have is we would like to benefit from Nature 2000 funding, because these are obviously in most of Nature 2000 areas higher costs. Even if we are a state-owned company, we would like to benefit here, and we don't care how you call it, like costs or investments. We doesn't care. We just want to have our money back.
Okay, that's very understandable. Thank you. I would like to put my next question perhaps to Emma once again. I read the action plan for, let's call it, better implementation of Natura 2000, and I was a bit surprised that in my perspective, as a scientist, not knowledgeable about the political background, the targets on funding Natura 2000 seem to be a bit soft. There is this strengthening of investment is highlighted, but then there's a talk about propose a 10% increase within life projects or within life, with no change in the overall budget, and then there is the promote the synergies with the cap. Emma, my question would be, coming from the forest owner perspective, is that enough? Or from your perspective, we heard from the previous speaker, he was quite clearly asking for money also, or do you think there is a need to create perhaps something more? We heard some comments about this by previous speakers. How do you assess this from the private owner perspective?
Yes, I think definitely the action plan talks about funding, but it doesn't go very far, also for political reasons, with not preempting other policy discussions, which we understand. But of course, we think that more funding is needed. We have problem with the existing funding, especially in the rural development program. We have low uptake there, and we see that the payment levels are too low and that the bureaucracy is too high. So it's, especially for small-scale forest owners, very difficult to access these funds. And of course, I would totally agree with my colleague from the State Forest that, I mean, funding is important, and to have a legal certainty as well over the compensation, that the measures that go beyond the existing requirements should be compensated. And I mean, it's also comes back to what I mentioned a bit earlier, that we often hear this, which is very nice, that the costs are much, much lower than the benefits of having this network, but there is a discrepancy of who is bearing the cost and who is gaining the benefits. So, of course, funding is a crucial issue. And that being said, I also want to stress that it's not the only issue. It's not like if you only solve funding, then you solve the issue, because there is anyway beyond that the need for the acceptance, which was, I think, highlighted by the fact that some forest owners may not even want that funding, and they don't want to be part of it because there might be an underlying complete lack of trust and belief in the system from the beginning. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Emma, for highlighting this, that funding is only one pillar. Andreas, I think there was a recent publication by the WWF relating to Natura 2000 where the term paper parks was used. I would be interesting also to learn from you what can be done, and also you used some strong words in your initial statement about policy failure. What can be done from an NGO perspective to have better implementation, which sort of seems to be the consensus after the REFIT process. We need better implementation. Is funding a key instrument? What could be done there, and what else would be needed? Also complementing on what previous speakers had been said.
Yeah. So the report was called Preventing Paper Bugs, to be very precise. So our view, yes, there are many paper bugs. Half of the network has a management plan. So half of the network, we don't know. So therefore, definitely you can say it's not clear what's happening there, and it's not very strategic. And I think one main conclusion which I take, and I'm following Natura 2000 since the beginning of '95 in Austria, at that case when I was working in WWF Austria, joined the EU. I think we made, or probably many of the member states made a mistake and didn't involve stakeholders in the early process of Natura 2000, which means in a site designation. And it was mentioned already. I also know cases where landowners even didn't know about that their forest was being proposed as a site. So the lesson learned now in the next step, when you have to draw up the management plans and the conservation objectives, we should learn out of these mistakes, and we need to work with the landowners, we need to work with the stakeholders. So that process would allow you to gain trust on the one hand, because I think you can't also compensate everything. So you can put a lot of money to Natura 2000, but if someone doesn't want to implement it, you can put even more, but if he or she doesn't want. So it's important that the process as such on the management is very inclusive, involving disciplines, the stakeholders, the landowners, environmental NGOs. And by having that plan, what I would propose, or what we are proposing, you can do a very specific cost estimate. What are the costs, and this time I call it costs if you want, what are the cost estimates of Natura 2000? And you go then to the commissioner, responsible commissioners, also to present, these are the costs. You decided, you wanted to have that legislation in place, you proved that legislation as being fit for purpose, that's what the costs are related, or the investment which is needed. And I think by having such a process, would include on the one hand stakeholders being involved, it would include having an open dialogue also about the benefits, and they are really far higher than what the investment or costs are needed. And at the very end, it would, I think, gain a lot of trust for the Natura 2000 network. I still think it's important to have positive wording, so I would go still with the investment angle. What I can offer as WWF, we are willing to help and to do that together, to gain forces on that, in respect of the conservation objectives, in respect of the management, in respect of getting the money towards it. I just wanted to highlight the big fight is not about then how much money will go to the environment and how much will go to the forest. The big fight will be how much goes to forest and how much goes to agriculture. That's the big fight, because the question is not how much we will give to the forest owners in Europe, it's where you want to take away the money, because the budget, especially the next budget, is very limited. And to give you just a picture of how I would see that's what I tried to describe now. I see it in a way like a birth, but a difficult birth, probably a cesarean, so an artificial birth, which has left some wounds, which are probably at the beginning also very painful, and you will see that all the time. These are the wounds which we have made by not involving the stakeholders, but at the very end you have got something very, very nice which changed your life and which is very beautiful, a baby, and this is the Natura 2000 network. And we should look at that. Thank you very much.
Okay, so then coming to our 20 years old baby, Christian, many of the comments made were indicating at the necessity to talk with each other, to be inclusive in the policy making, but also highlighting the importance of funding. I think the French way, or PES way, is a bit known for this, but in your initial statement you said something like, well, it's good and not good. And I would like you to elaborate a bit further. So what do you think is really good there, and what has not worked, and where do you need for additional policy support, perhaps from the EU level?
Thank you. I think the most important thing is to have a strategic vision based on a phased approach, a step-by-step approach. And what is important is to establish clearly and to assume three different types of objectives. The first objective is that the second generation of management plan must be more requiring than the first generation. It is a step-by-step. We have to increase the ambition. So in France, we are beginning this second step. And it's very important to have in conscious that it is crucial not to have only a negotiated approach, but to increase the ambitions according to science. And it's not very easy. The second objective is that we need to maintain motivation and involvement of stakeholders and their capacity to negotiate and to implement what has been agreed. And also it is not very easy because donc, motivation can disappear without doing noise. Donc, we have no conflicts, but we have no longer motivation. And so, donc, management is quiet and quiet, donc, and everything is disappearing inside the Natura 2000 without conflicts, without explaining what has happened, but we shall need donc, 10 years to be conscious what has done, donc, what has evolved on the field. And the third objective is that we need to gratify, both by money, but also with pride, those stakeholders, especially forest owners, were strongly involved and accepted efforts. Donc, our only estimation of the extra cost donc, linked with Natura 2000 donc, has been made donc, by the Office National des Forêts, the manager of the French state forests. It is more or less around 20%. It's a difficult question because donc, to discuss with funders, we have to prove the extra cost compared with silvicultural reference paths. Donc, and we can't agree nowadays in France what is or what must be donc, the reference paths. Donc, and so to estimate the extra cost is very difficult, but it is an important work to be done. We have also donc, to take into account donc, some problems. Donc, first, donc, the survey which is organized by the Commission donc, every 6 years donc, about population and the status of conservation donc, is not done only inside Natura 2000 sites. And so donc, we have data which are very, very difficult to explain to stakeholders donc, which are gathered to deal with one Natura 2000 sites. And also the criteria which has been adopted from a scientific point of view donc, are not very easily understandable for local forest owners. And it gives very, very often a very pessimistic donc, view. And when you explain to people which have discussed, who have adopted a management plan, who have done efforts, that the situation donc, is worse than before donc, the beginning of Natura 2000 network, what are the results? Donc, the motivation is decreasing. And the third donc, and most important question for local manager is this question: did I do well? Donc, what are the results of my efforts? And nowadays, this question is not at all taken in charge inside the Natura 2000 organization. We need, and we strongly need, to be able to assess the efficiency of already decided and implemented measures, to be able to adapt them or to change them, including the question of cost efficiency. Sometimes inside donc, discussion around donc, a particular Natura 2000 sites, the discussion is about very ambitious measure with a high level of cost. And everybody is avoiding discussion about very small practical measure whose cost is very low. Donc, and so donc, the discussion is governed by this question of cost and very symbolic on the high level donc, cost, and has not a global vision. But it's normal because nobody is able nowadays to help donc, forest owners to discuss about the efficiency, the practical efficiency of already adopted measures. And if we want to have a second generation of management plan which will be donc, more requiring, if we are not able donc, to discuss about the efficiency of already implemented measures, it will be very, very difficult to avoid the facility Donc, we adopted some measures, donc more or less it is functioning, and so we shall go on for next generation of management plan for 10 or 15 years. Donc, it will not be a good situation to improve donc, Natura 2000 efficiency. And also the question is not only about technical measure, donc, because we also need to understand the difference between the adopted measure, the negotiated measure, and the implemented measure. Donc, sometimes you have beautiful things on the paper. Everybody agreed about a measure, but everybody understands this measure in a different way. And so the question is at the level of implementation. And if you pay no attention to this difference, donc, it will be also very difficult to adapt donc, the measure. We need to understand why is this difference. And that's why donc, we need the help of scientists competent in biology and ecology, but we need also the help of sociologists.
Okay.
Money and methodology are very important donc, for this type of approach.
Thank you, Christian. Then we did quite a good job in this study, I think, because many sociologists and policy scientists have contributed. There would be many, many more things to say, and also I didn't give all the panelists the floor 2 times. I would like to excuse for this already now, but you have a chance for a final take-home message that can be very strong from your side. Now I would like to really open up the discussion and give the auditory, the plenary, the chance to put your questions to the panelists and voice your concern, but also perhaps give comments. We heard a lot about the implementation of Natura 2000 in forests, about effectiveness, about different experience from different angles. Please, your comments and your questions, and perhaps we try to collect 3 or 4, and please make sure that you say whom you address, if you're not addressing anyone. There's a question, comment over there, and one here. And hopefully someone has a mic. You have it on the chair.
Okay. My name is Ludmila Marušáková, and I'm representing Forest Europe, Secretariat of the Forest Europe. And actually, I'm not going to ask the question to any particular speaker, but I would like to reflect on the discussion what was going on during this morning, as well as I would like to address the study itself. Since monitoring of forest biodiversity was addressed and touched upon at a large scale during the preparation of the study. But first of all, I would like to congratulate to organizers, European Forest Institute, for this excellent event and for the preparation of this study. And we would also like to thanks and appreciate your efforts to bring together scientific community as well as policymakers. And from my position or from my perspective, I would also like to highlight our readiness to join forces, it was mentioned before, and contribute to science policy dialogue. When it comes to reporting or monitoring of forest biodiversity, at this stage I would like to highlight that forest pan-European set of indicators that was endorsed in 2015 at the Madrid Ministerial Conference is a basic tool for monitoring and communicating and promoting sustainable forest management in a very complex way. And it means that besides environmental, social aspects, also environmental, social, economic aspects must be taken into consideration. And biodiversity conservation plays a crucial, vital role in our set. And at this moment, I want to stress that biodiversity indicators have a privilege in our set of indicators because we have more than 10 indicators. Besides that, there are many of other indicators, so-called traditional indicators like forest area, growing stocks, and so on, that could be also taken into consideration while talking about biodiversity. But the main message I would like to convey to this audience is that The further development and update of indicators is something which is ongoing process, and I would like to stress that our process, Forest River process, is very inclusive and is open to all stakeholders, to all partners besides the countries, to all NGOs. So we are open to discuss the new set of indicators or development of new indicators, but bearing in mind some reporting burdens that need to be decreased from the perspective of countries. So we are willing to, and we would appreciate closer cooperation with all stakeholders. We are running expert group meetings on expert on indicators, so we are here to be in touch with all experts and scientific community.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this. That was more a statement. Perhaps I can ask the people in the plenary to be quite concise and put perhaps more challenging comments or questions also to our panelists, that we have more an interactive discussion. There were some more showing up. I see Markus Lindner, if I.
Markus Lindner, European Forest Institute. I want to come back to the funding question and how we can make the Natura 2000 targets more effective also in the future. We have been involved in an evaluation study looking at the rural development forestry measures, and we were discussing with stakeholders in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, one of the two regions in Germany where they opted to use the rural development measures to support Natura 2000 compensation payments. And we talked with stakeholders and they said that it's so enormously inefficient, the bureaucracy is so high that they probably spend more than half of the available funding is on the filling out the forms and making all the requirements, getting them in place. What is left for the forest owners is not sufficient. So we do hear that the forest owners are very proud about the achievements they can actually create with their sustainable forest management. And they were, I think, what I hear also from the panelists here with representing the forestry sector, we would have, I think, willingness to support more biodiversity-friendly management in the future. So can't we resolve the challenge that you, Andreas, said, where do we take away budget? Shouldn't we take away budget from the bureaucracy, not taking away from agriculture towards forestry, but rather try to design some more forward-looking instruments? And there were some voices saying that we should actually have an evidence-based, results-oriented target for improving our status in the forest, and then compensate for achieved improvements of the results. Would that be a way forward?
So are you addressing someone specifically, or it's general to the panel?
I think that there were several panelists have been touching this point, and I think the question is, do we have to radically change our way of compensating our management from in advance making applications and then getting some returns sometimes in the future towards designing a stronger evidence-based monitoring, which allows them to actually compensate achievements compared to the status, which has then hopefully been improving over the time, because our ambition is to actually favor biodiversity with our integrated management. Thank you.
Okay, please note this down. Are there more questions or comments? Over there, and then there. Perhaps you were first, at least in my tunnel view. And then time. Please use the microphone, which is somewhere in your chair. Because could you please use the microphone? I can hear you quite well here, but I don't think the others.
Sorry. I am Juan Luis Moragues from Basque Country in Spain, and I am a lawyer. In this moment, we are working about refunding the nature rules and forest law in unitary regulation. And my question is about the economic dimension of the problem, and what is your opinion about the fiscality or the tax rules to promote or to boost the change in the behaviors and the practice of the forest and the Natura 2000 protection, because in this moment in Spain the tax policies are don't take in account these measures and these policies. In France, in Bavarian, what is the answer for that, please?
Okay, thank you. Talking about taxes as an instrument to better implement Natura 2000. I would like to take one more, Taina, I think, and then we come to the panel to respond.
Yes, thank you, Georg. Taina Veltheim from Finland, Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry. So we heard by Methodi and also by some of the panelists that there has been conflicts and there has been problems. Also in Finland's case, the Natura 2000 exercise was poorly planned, communicated and implemented, and it really turned the forest owners against nature conservation in general. Of course, now time has passed and there is not so many ambitions concerning Natura 2000 anymore. And then we have introduced a voluntary nature conservation scheme, especially for southern Finland, where are much less protected areas than in northern and eastern Finland. But I would be very interested to know, is there any country where the process has been fairly smooth without many major conflicts? And if so, I think that this should be reported very carefully and very well to the maybe newcomers to the EU, which countries have to implement the Natura 2000. And then if not, if this has been a very problematic process in all countries, then if the report writers studied that, what is the reason for that? Was there too little guidance from the Commission, or what would have been needed to have a smooth process? Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Taina, for asking an interesting question. I would like to give the floor to the panelists. We basically had the three questions, one relating, can we do the payment for Natura 2000, the funding more effective, more evidence-based? Then this question, what role for taxes? Could this be an implementing mechanism? Then the final question by Taina, talking about the challenges and conflicts. Are there examples of countries where everything worked quite well? Who wants to respond? And I have difficulties to see you all. You have to show up like that. Okay, Christian, and then Jürgen. And then Andreas.
Yeah. It's about the question of Natura 2000 and tax exemption or tax reduction. Donc, we explored this option in 2007. Donc, and the Parliament adopted some fiscality rules, donc specially dedicated to Natura 2000. Donc the problem comes from three difficulties which has been not well appreciated. Donc the first of all, I think that more or less every country, every European country is engaged in a great process of simplification, including fiscality, and we had more and more difficulties to defend a measure whose amount remains quite low, and in the name of simplification, the pressure was higher and higher. The second difficulties we underestimate is that the question is to have compensation. If you have tax exemption or tax reduction, you have to be very clear about what are the engagement taken by the beneficiary. And it was not so easy to adapt the fiscality instrument and the level of engagement connected with fiscality. And the third problem is that in our scheme we underestimate the possibility for some private owners to maximize this option to avoid tax. And so last year the French government, which has also financial difficulties, it's an evidence, decided to delete this tax scheme.
Okay, thank you. Not so promising experiences then from France. The next on my list is, I think, Jürgen Bauhaus.
Yeah. I would like to respond to the statement by the lady from Forest Europe and also try to link that to the question by Markus Lindner. I think that Forest Europe has a number of good indicators for biodiversity monitoring. But monitoring of biodiversity is incredibly complex. And the list of indicators is by far not comprehensive enough to assess some of the things that we're really interested in. We have done, for example, a study where we tried to distill an index, for example, of structural diversity, because structure captures a lot that is relevant for biodiversity. So the number of tree species, the layering, the amount of dead wood in different stages of decomposition, and so on, from our national forest inventory, which is pretty much similar to many other forest inventories across Europe. And we've linked that information to probably one of the best data sets that we have on forest biodiversity, which comes from research sites in Germany, which are called the biodiversity exploratories, where people have measured everything, from yeasts and bacteria in the soil to birds and small mammals and all sorts of invertebrates, all in the same plot. And there you can relate the structural information to this information on taxonomic diversity. And while we do get some relationships, they're extremely variable. And they show us that with this information that we do get from classical forest inventories, it is limited in terms of the extent that we can relate that to actual taxonomic diversity, which is what we care about as well. However, I'm a strong believer that we should, expand and refine these conventional forest inventories with this information. And for example, move the current inventory that we have on Natura 2000, which is on a 6-year cycle. Who dreamt that up? Yeah? To incorporate that with the 10-year cycle, as we have for forests, which is much more fitting. It is in line with the current inventory. And then we can actually also relate this information, which is very important, to information about management. Because with conventional forest inventories, we can assess management intensity, for example. And we can directly relate, the consequence for biodiversity to information about what actually happened. And don't have to have subjective assessments on what is the possible threat of management, forest management, which is often seen as a threat to Natura 2000, rather than a vehicle to achieve outcomes. So I'm very much in favor of actually marrying these two systems to achieve outcomes that are better interpretable. And Markus, I think you almost gave the answer already to your question. It would of course be desirable to link funding to outcomes that could also be linked to inventories, which are again on a 10-year cycle. Why should a forest owner apply every year for something when he can only demonstrate after 10 years what he or she has achieved? So why not move that to a longer cycle and have that based more on evidence?
Okay, thank you, Jürgen. And I noticed that this is getting more and more romantic. We have a 20-year-old baby. And now we have some proposals to marry different inventories. And I think there's perhaps some possibilities also later during our snack lunch to explore this a bit further with the experts in the room of the different monitoring systems. I still have Andreas and Emma, and I would like you to perhaps give a short response that we have another chance to take some comments from the auditory.
Thank you very much.
Whatever question you want to respond now.
Yeah,
so.
I think I want to respond to two questions. The first one, which was related to financing Natura 2000, and the third one, whether there are any smooth countries and the site designation of Natura 2000 works well. So on the first question again, how to create this momentum that we get more support. I think we can't tell where to take away the money. So in the EU budget, and I focus mainly now on EU budget. But the baseline is, as I mentioned before, you need to have a cost estimate. You need to go to Commissioner for the budget Oettinger saying this is the cost for forests in Natura 2000. So you need to have your homework done. But then you need to create emotions, because political will is not based on facts and figures. And I would just recall a meeting I had with the cabinet of Juncker after the decision of the fitness check was made. That's the reason why I got, I think, the meeting at the very end, by the way. I had a long debate about how we could link the discussion of Natura 2000 to the future of Europe. I think at the highest level in the Commission, they are aware to create support for the EU, for the idea of the European Union. It's not about facts and figures, it's about emotions. And Natura 2000 is everywhere in Europe. It's in every corner of Europe, and it's linked with emotions, positive and negative emotions. But I think it's about our Europe, our future. It's about our home we have. And I think by using that debate, linking this also this debate, you could create a sort of a momentum also for that needs to get more support. And I think that's what I wanted to mention, that on the one hand you need to have the basic figures, and then you need to work on this political will, which I mentioned in the beginning, and it's a different type of approach you need to take. So you need to see the bigger picture, you need to look at the framework, and then I think we would be able to release and to get attention and to get more money also in the next EU budget for forests and Natura 2000. So that's my first feedback on the question one. On the third question, which was, is there a country where Natura 2000 implementation works easy, is smooth? Yes, it's Switzerland. It's not part of the EU. And they had difficulties to establish their Emerald network, which is the counterpart to Natura 2000. So the answer is obviously no. So I only have been told that, and that was before I've started working on conservation, that the process on the site designation was very well done in the UK. They approached all stakeholders, they have written to stakeholders, they involved them. Probably that's the reason why the average on the site designation is lower than in other countries. But in a way, that was I was told. But I don't think on the implementation the UK is doing much better, to be very honest. But on the site designation, they probably tried to have a proper involvement with some stakeholders. Probably the Commission can respond to that question. I don't know. That was I was told, but it was before my time. So yes, it's Switzerland, and I don't think it's military. Thank you.
So we are losing the positive example in the EU then. Thank you. I would like to continue with Emma, who still also want to contribute to the responses to the questions.
Thank you. I will just make a short comment on the statement from Forest Europe and also on about the funding and how to do that. So when it comes to the assessments, I think what we heard also, there is a kind of communication issue also. We have, I mean, forest owners, they have been managing their forests for a very long time in a good way, balancing different objectives, and it led to the forest being in a state that made them worthy of being Natura 2000 sites. And then they did implement certain measures, and I think we can see we have the objective national forest inventories, which are feeding into the Forest Europe report, and we see there that there is progress. We have indicators which are showing positive developments. So we have done things on the ground. And then this is contra than this subjective approach of the State of Nature report, where there is also a communication issue saying that 80% of the habitats are unfavorable, which means the habitats types and not the area. But it's also what was mentioned before, it's forest owners feel like they are doing things, but then they feel like, okay, but everything is bad and you're getting blamed somehow. So I think there needs to be some more work on how to actually measure this. And I think also the State of Nature report also was highlighted in the Court of Auditors report that there is problems with the reliability of the data and the comparability of the data in this report. And then when it comes to the result-based payments, I think this is an option that could be explored, but my understanding is that we don't really have any examples, so we should investigate how it could work. And I fully agree that there is this need to look at the long-term issue as well. Can we see the results? When can we see the results? Because for forest owners, there might be a big risk with this approach as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma, for again highlighting a bit the emotional side, but also making or taking up a concrete proposal to think about more evidence result-based funding of Natura 2000 in forests. I would like to give the chance for you again, very short question, 2 we can take, with very short responses, and then we have to come already to the final round. But then there's again chance to discuss further during lunch. Are there any? Okay, over there. And please be very short and concise.
Thank you. My name is Hannes Böttcher. I work for Öko-Institut in Germany. I have a question to Mark de Mismaker. Maybe you highlighted the importance of aligning policies so that more Natura 2000 maybe should be thought in other EU legislations. Do you follow the discussion of the RED Renewable Energy Directive, and maybe can you take this as an example of how more nature conservation issues could be addressed in other policies?
Thank you. We take a second question, and then you have the chance to respond. Mr. Hausmann, German BML.
Yeah, Thomas Hausmann from the German Ministry of Agriculture. Coming back to the monitoring issue and the reporting, and I was very happy with the suggestion from Mr. Bauhus and also the comments just now from Emma. So we heard from Forest Europe that there is work going on. I would like to ask the Commission directly, are there any ideas or plans to adjust the monitoring and reporting in future, also to avoid this kind of misunderstandings which was just mentioned several times today?
Okay, 2 clear questions with 2 clear addresses. The first one to Mark, talking about basically policy integration and the need to have a more favorable policy environment for Natura 2000. Are you following the other policies, and how do you see it?
As a matter of fact, I do, yes. I'm also involved as a shadow rapporteur on the RED. So this is one. I'm very much convinced that it needs a horizontal approach, and it's a bit also what I lack in the action plan. I'm very much convinced that mainstreaming Natura 2000 and wider biodiversity measures with other policies like the CAP, Common Agriculture Policy, and cohesion policy are really urgent. That is what we also are trying. We're drafting up now an oral question because after the fitness check, it's now the action plan that draws our attention most as politicians in the European Parliament. And I think together with the colleagues of the other groups, I think that there is indeed consent that this is one of the key issues we have to address and confront also the European Commission with. Indeed.
Okay, thanks a lot. And then I think the second question by Mr. Hausmann was directly addressing the Commission. I think the Commission is not in the panel, so perhaps I can invite you to shortly come to the microphone, or perhaps you have it on your place, and to respond shortly to this monitoring question. So do you want to be more integrated in monitoring?
Are you listening to me? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I will stick just to this question, although I would have lots of comments from all this debate. But one thing I can assure you, on this issue of monitoring, we will certainly not be in defensive mode. We trust a lot on the transparency of the process that now gathers information for the State of Nature report. And the action plan does foresee improved knowledge and means to get the monitoring more accurate. So with this, what I can say is I'm totally in favor of the evidence base, and if we have a problem here that we are getting different pictures because we are asking different questions, we should set the questions right, get the facts right, and start from there. So you can count on us to approach this a more evidence-based element of Natura. What we are not available to is to dilute it so as to get a rosy picture and everyone would be pleased that everything is sustainable. We want the facts, and from that we should build something more constructive.
Okay, good to hear. I see the coordinator of the study showing up, but please shortly if you want to comment on that. And then we need to... you should use the microphone.
Thank you, Georg. Just a follow-up to this very important topic of forest biodiversity monitoring. I would like to make some advertisements. Luckily, I'm involved in another Horizon 2020 funded project. Thank you to the Commission for spending money on a lot of money on this important topic. We're dealing there with issues of forest information and its use for policy making and evidence-based decisions. I would like to make an advertisement here. In the beginning of February next year, we are going to organize a 3-day workshop here taking place in Brussels. And on one of these 3 days, we are going to discuss exactly these issues of how to improve the forest biodiversity monitoring in Europe, focusing very much on the Natura 2000 topic. So if you haven't received any invitation by us, please drop me a message and I'll be glad to put you on the invitees list, because I think the topic is so important, so timely. So I would like to invite you all to consider attending this workshop. The places are a bit limited. I would like to thank the Forestry House, Emma and Piotr, for kindly accepting to host this workshop or this series of workshops. Well, please, drop me a message and voice your interest. It will be really a pleasure to continue these discussions. Thank you.
Okay, so we had this small advertisement block. Now we are coming back to the panel and the final conclusions. I would like to ask the panelists to take 30 seconds off and think about this classical elevator take-home message. You have 40, 50 seconds to think about what you heard today about Natura 2000. What's your key take-home message for your work relating to Natura 2000? And please try to respect this, let's say 40, 50 seconds. Otherwise, the elevator will stop without you having been able to finalize your closing statements. We would start this time from the very back with Jürgen. I continue talking for 2 or 3, for 20 or 30 seconds to give him at least some time to make his elevator statements. And I think there's also an elevator at the University of Freiburg, which possibly takes him about 40 seconds to come to his first floor institute. Jürgen, 30, 40 seconds. What's your key take-home message relating to Natura 2000 implementation and forest that you have from here?
Well, a thought that is also expressed in this report is that the system needs to become a bit more flexible, to be fit to tackle some of the challenges that we're facing. We want multifunctional forests, and that means also functioning forests, functioning also in the face of climate change and global change. And at the moment, the concept is mostly guided by the principle of naturalness and not necessarily the principles of adaptability and resilience. We're losing tree species all the time. We're getting new ones that we don't want and other things that we don't want. And many of the sites that we have dedicated for Natura 2000 are actually threatened by climate change. And therefore, I think we need to rethink also how we can increase the flexibility in the system so that it maintains biodiversity conservation in multifunctional forests.
Thank you, Jürgen. Elevator has arrived. Emma, what's your take-home message for your daily work relating to Natura 2000? What did you learn?
I think a very key take-home message is the involvement of the landowners, the forest owners, respecting the ownership rights. I think we all agree that we want a successful implementation of Natura 2000, and we have seen that there are good examples out there as well, and we can move forward and always strive to do things in a better way. But I think we should also take a step back and also see the bigger picture, as was mentioned earlier, and also remember that EU forests are actually a success story and example for the rest of the world. We are taking responsibility, and also by balancing the 3 pillars of sustainability, which is what we have to do, we are able to meet some of the biggest challenges that are facing society today. We have climate change, and we have jobs and growth, also especially in rural areas, that are also a big part of this puzzle and needs to be a part of this balance. And I would highlight that a competitive forest sector is a fundamental prerequisite to also support the biodiversity and the social benefits from forests. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I see how you got the award, Emma. The next one is Rudolf. What will you tell in your
very
elevator?
Difficult question for me, because I fear my daily work is pretty much away from the atmosphere of an international press center. We are doing practical forestry, but I was positively surprised, because we agreed in a lot of things which I think are very important for Natura 2000 and are very important for landowners and for state forest organizations too. So I understood that we really agreed that the communication with landowners should be improved, and that it should be really a discussion and not a presentation of solutions. This is very important as far as I'm concerned, and what we really, I got the impression that we are also agreed in the questions that forests are very flexible and dynamic systems, and therefore we can't work with static regulations. So we have to bring some dynamic factors in those regulations to be able to react on certain situations will come up in the future, probably. And the third thing I'm really happy about is that we all agreed that funding is really necessary for getting a wide acceptance in Europe, and especially in the state forest organizations too. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And let's continue with Andreas. What's your elevator take-home message?
Well, I will try again to paint a picture. And so my wife, she gave birth to 3 kids, all 3 by the way cesarean. And people always ask me, how is your life? And I said, well, it has become more difficult, but far more beautiful with having 3 kids. And I think it's similar in our professional life with Natura 2000. So our life has become more difficult, but more beautiful. So, and the take-home message of today, I think together, I think we can make something out of that. And that's a very positive message. And I would like also to thank again for the organizers to have that discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for taking up again the baby wedding metaphors. Christian, what will you tell?
Donc, I propose to you to identify 3 increasing questions which have been either very shortly mentioned or not mentioned at all. The first question, which has been very quickly mentioned, is Natura 2000 towards climate change and connectivity. You have new bodies, institutions taking in charge this question, but with big difficulties to have articulated links with Natura 2000. And we need help to explain that there are connections. And it's very difficult. If from the Natura 2000 responsibility point of view, we have no clear offer to discuss about this question. It's totally theoretical to think that scientists dealing with climate change will spontaneously taking in charge Natura 2000. The second question, which has been not mentioned, is that more or less Natura 2000 management plans are founded on the idea we need to manage, we need to intervene, to act. But in an increasing part of the forest of France, it's more and more difficult to identify landowners. And even if we can identify them, they don't want to do anything, even with money funding. So what is the responsibility about Natura 2000 site on forests which has been managed for a long time, centuries, and now who has the responsibility? Local authority to decide from their point of view, they have the right to intervene, to protect some species or not. It's a very difficult question. And the third question is about the contribution of the Natura 2000 sites to common biodiversity. We act in favor of remarkable species, but we have also other effects. And it's clear, it has been studied, especially for common birds. Some Natura 2000 help not remarkable bird species, but habitat specialists which benefit from Natura 2000 sites. And so we need to think about remarkable biodiversity, but we need also to show the contribution of Natura 2000 to common biodiversity.
Okay, thanks. It seems the elevators are getting slower and slower, as to be expected. And I would like now to even slow down it a bit more. Mark, I had to skip you in the first round. You didn't have the chance for a second statement. So first, be very short and concise on your take-home message, but then take a bit more time with the slow elevator to explore a bit from the perspective of the European Parliament, looking at the action plan for, I call it always better implementation. Mm-hmm. Do you think that all these things that came up, are they enough reflected in that plan, or do you see a need for encouraging additional measures? So you have an interesting elevator
yes,
now.
Yes, well, let me say yes, the action plan aims to rapidly improve, of course, the implementation of nature directives, and it is a step in the good direction. We all have to admit that. But the Commission is the Commission, and I'm a politician, I'm a member of the Parliament, so I have to be critical and I have to encourage them to do better and to accelerate maybe. And then I have to say, no, for us it's not really sufficient. And as I've said as answering one of the questions, we are now, we have adopted an oral question and we're preparing a resolution with the colleagues. What we regret is, well, there is reference to the 2020 biodiversity strategy, but it's not more than a reference. It's not going beyond a reference, and we miss something there. It's also it is really unclear for me and for a lot of my colleagues how the Commission will respond to wider calls. Repeated wider calls of the European Parliament to achieve these 2020 targets. And what strategy the Commission considers necessary after 2020. This is very important. We get some vision beyond 2020 also. For instance, and I haven't mentioned it yet, but we're really looking forward to a real proposal for the development of a European network for green infrastructure. We are missing that. We are missing an EU initiative on pollinators. We are missing further actions to address illegal killings of birds. So we expect something more. There's the mainstreaming, as I have already said, also with other policies like the CAP, the cohesion policy, and of course the funding. Also there we need to see that beyond 2020 in the next MFF we see adequate funding there. So I can assure you that, that we will continue to follow this topic very closely. And as a politician, yes, if I can make my conclusion, then I see it as my mission to contribute to raising awareness also of Natura 2000. We've seen that it works when it is really well implemented, and also raising awareness and to emphasize that cherishing biodiversity and nature is also a matter of every citizen, because I represent these citizens. They have elected me, and it starts there. You know, it starts with us, with the citizens. And that's the message I bring home, try to bring home every day. It can start in your own garden, yeah? Up to, of course, the beautiful forests we have. There is plenty of possibilities to give nature a hand. And by the way, I really like the metaphors of the babies.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mark. Then I think I have to close this now. We started this morning with or we didn't start it, but we had this opportunity this morning to get some more information on the topic of Natura and forests. We heard an interesting study, reviewed many of the different elements, and I think we had quite an interesting panel discussion, not only with a lot of family metaphors and emotions, but also with a lot of interesting hints towards the key question that's now, after the REFIT process, in my view, in the Rome, this better implementation. What can we do? What can we do jointly? Just to highlight some issues very shortly: evidence-based funding, for instance, the whole question of a more integrated monitoring structure, then this emotional aspect, the aspect of who's excluded, who's included, and possibilities to deal with this. Also some more innovative funding instruments were mentioned, and flexibility was raised, and again funding and this necessity to engage in participation. Well, I think we also learned that beyond this, forests are sort of a key resource in Natura 2000. Perhaps also in green infrastructure. The Commission now got a lot of homeworks in the last take-home message for the future, but also perhaps as a role model that was mentioned by some of the speakers for implementing Natura 2000. If people work together, if we get the emotional side right, and also if we get perhaps the funding aspect right, an integrated approach was mentioned by several of the panelists. It's interesting to follow up, I think, also from EFI side on the topic, also in the broader context of the action plan implementation of the CAP reform that was not very often mentioned here, but also perhaps linking to topics like the Brexit. That's perhaps something you should not say too often here in this Brussels environment, but it might also have an interesting effect because UK was very much behind the nature directives in the past. And I was wondering if perhaps also to our donor countries, if we might organize a similar study in 2 or 3 years, taking the same questions and asking a bit, what have we learned? Where have we come from here? Where are the improvements? Again, inviting the sciences, the scientific disciplines to scan the evidence and to come up with policy recommendations. That's a small hint to some of our donor countries that are in the room. I would like to then close this and give you a chance to connect over snack with saying again thank you. Perhaps first to the Multi-Donor Trust Fund for policy support for the 10 governments, the government of Austria, Czech Republic, Finland, France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, Norway, Spain, and Sweden. I hope I did not forget any government. If not, let me know. For supporting our work at EFI with this idea of bringing the latest scientific evidence to action, to policy making also here in Brussels. I would like to really, really warmly thank the speakers of this day and the panelists for their time and efforts and for their willingness to work on a really broad field of the implementation on Natura 2000. There are, I think, easier topics where you can concentrate more than on this issue. And last but not least, I would like to thank again the authors of the study, who I believe invested much more time than what we actually funded or what the countries actually funded for, and who had a lot of extra sessions, especially in the end, with all the many comments you got, and you did a perfect job, I believe. And in the very, very end, I also would like to thank the EFI team, policy support communications, who has done a great job. And I think the PowerPoint issue was not in our hands, I would assume. So now I would like to, I hope I did not forget any important person, otherwise Laurie might correct me. I would like to then give you the chance to build your own green infrastructure, your social green infrastructure now outside. There are some snacks, there's something to drink. There's time to continue discussing. We did not have the time to really go into depth with all these issues, but I think a lot has been thrown on the table, and it's now time to follow up a bit and think what can be done concretely, which is also a bit beyond the science mission EFI has. Thank you.